and all alone.
Events after the shooting added to the existing outrage in Pakistan. That's when a U.S. consulate vehicle drove the wrong way down a one-way street, killing a motorcyclist before leaving the scene. Tens of thousands of protesters have rallied in Lahore to demand justice. The U.S. sent a senior congressional delegation to demand that Islamabad free Davis. However, fearing a major backlash, the Pakistani government says it will let the court decide. That's not good enough for some U.S. lawmakers, who are now threatening to stop aid to Pakistan. The event is now creating a complex scenario, with Pakistan jeopardizing its relations with its largest provider of economic and military assistance, while the USA stands to alienate one of its major allies in the war next door in Afghanistan. Kamal Haider, Al Jazeera, Islamabad.
And in the last hour, the State Department spokesman P.J. Crowley denied reports that the U.S. had canceled meetings with Pakistan over Mr. Davis's detention.
The reports that we have suspended all contacts with the Pakistani government is not true. We continue to have high-level contacts with both in Pakistan and here to be able to express to them the importance that we attach to resolving this issue in this case. And we'll use every opportunity in our engagement with the Pakistani government to reiterate that position.
For more on the case, I'm joined now by Adil Najam, a professor of international relations at Boston University in Massachusetts. Thanks for joining us. Is the Raymond Davis case another type of Blackwater case in the making?
It's not in the making. It's very much a Blackwater case. The gentleman who goes by the name of Raymond Davis, and that itself is now in question whether that's his name, is clearly a civilian employee within the consulate in Lahore. And all evidence seems to suggest that he was either with the company that used to be called Blackwater or something like that. And that's what's making this all the more complex. Both Pakistan and US are in a really bad state. But in some ways, if he's let go, things will become even worse, both for the US and Pakistan in terms of public perception.
Professor, if you were advising both the U.S. and Pakistan, how would you tell them to back away from this tense situation?
I think you're exactly right. They need to back away. They need to get to a place where we talk less and less about this case rather than more and more. I really do think that the first step has to be a real apology by the U.S. There were 2 people killed. It might have been self-defense, but they were killed. There was a third person who was trampled by an embassy vehicle, and that's actually the worst part, because this is just a bystander. So I think a first step would be an apology for the human loss. Then bring in the diplomacy question. For the Pakistan government in Islamabad, the question is really more complex because this happened in Lahore, which is the provincial province capital of Punjab, where a different party is in control. So the Pakistan government needs to get its internal politics in order. But the first step, I really think, has to be to turn this from a diplomatic row into a human case and to start with an apology for just the lives lost.
Isn't all this, though, complicated, Professor, by the fact that there was already anti-U.S. sentiment because of the use of, or suspected use of, Predator drones to go after Taliban insurgents in the Northwestern Territories?
Exactly. Certainly the Predator drones, but also all the talk that one had been hearing about Blackwater in Pakistan, which was being denied both by the Pakistan government and the US government. What this case does is it brings that back to the top and kind of provides proof that in fact there was something. So the worst fears of the critics, the worst fears of the skeptics have all been proven true. Now, there could be an opportunity in this, and that would be if the US does actually real diplomacy rather than legal diplomacy, does public diplomacy. So rather than fighting about what the law says about immunity, if you turn it into a public diplomacy exercise, lives have been lost, we are really sorry about that, let's work towards mending those relations. It ain't going to be easy, but I think that's the only way.
All right, we will leave it there. Mr. Adil Najam of Boston University. I'll be back with more news later here in the Americas, including it's the economy. President Obama gets ready to send his budget to Congress, while his top banker says the U.S. recovery is still in trouble.
Let's return now to Egypt. While the protests continue, the process of mourning those who've died during Egypt's unrest has begun. Al Jazeera's Andrew Simmons reports now from Cairo on one family's grief.
Hassan had much to offer the old Egypt, even more to the new one. His desk and books where he left them. A graduate laboratory technician, he taught English in his spare time. Now a martyr in this neighborhood. Mustafa El-Sawi was 25 years old. And his brother Ehab, more determined now to spend days and nights in Tahrir Square, despite his injury from a baton round. In the daily throng of protesters, he carries deeper hatred of the regime that killed his unarmed brother.
Unlike the peace and calm right now, the scene was one of confrontation. Mustafa was at this precise spot. His friends say he lifted his right forefinger and uttered the Muslim testimony of faith. And it was at that point that automatic gunfire broke out, peppering his chest and his neck.
Mustafa died before he reached hospital, the finger still showing his faith in life and death. He was killed in the day of rage, Friday, January the 28th. A young man and woman the same age died alongside him. He had told his parents the day before he was going to take to the streets. They had warned him to be careful.
All those deaths won't be in vain. My son's death is just one drop in a sea of blood.
Mustafa decided to take part in the demonstrations to fight for freedom, justice and pride. The kind of pride that the Egyptian people had forgotten about.
He was a very well-mannered boy. He took care of me. He always looked after me and always made sure I took my medicine.
Ehab says he's proud of his brother. He's one face in a multitude of people with the same message. We won't leave. To Ehab, his mother and his father, the intelligent young man who was also a gifted singer, died for one cause only: the downfall of Mubarak soon and nothing less. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Well, Egypt's uprising is having a knock-on effect in Gaza, where fuel supplies are rapidly dwindling. Most people there use cheap petrol smuggled in via tunnels from their Egyptian neighbours. But the unrest has meant that the trade has almost ground to a halt. Nicole Johnston reports now from Rafah.
Arriving at petrol stations with empty soft drink bottles and containers and leaving with litres of fuel. The instability in Egypt has heightened Gaza's own sense of insecurity, and people have started hoarding cheap petrol and diesel that's smuggled in from Egypt.
We don't have our own products. We don't have fuel. We are under occupation. We are besieged from everywhere. So, thanks to Egypt, we can at least smuggle in fuel from the tunnels.
Almost everyone in Gaza buys Egyptian fuel because it's a third of the price of Israeli fuel. But in the early days of Egypt's crisis, the petrol smuggling trade ground to a halt and fuel stations closed.
First of all, what happened in Egypt affect Gaza direct. The first 3 or 4 days, the transportation from Cairo or Alexandria or Suez to El Arish and to Rafah was impossible because of security reasons.
Petrol smugglers say they are now back in business, and they hope Egypt's problems won't disrupt the cross-border trade.
The 3 fuel supply tunnels in Rafah stopped for almost a week since the instability in Egypt started. We have only 1 tunnel. Our supply has now started again. We smuggle between 80 and 100,000 litres per day.
The smuggled fuel ends up in one of these containers very close to the border. We're only about 100 metres from Egypt. Now you can see from here it's piped into tankers, and these tankers transport the fuel all over Gaza.
Despite this, people in Gaza are still worrying about the situation in Egypt and their dependence on its fuel.
Our people in Gaza have the mentality of the crisis all the time. They're fearing from any crisis. They think if the matters in Egypt going more hot, May the border will be closed.
Trade and tunnels connect Gaza to Egypt. And while the fuel may be flowing now, people are not taking the risk of it running out. Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
And the knock-on effects being felt much further afield. Stay with us to find out why a trip on Hosni Mubarak's plane has led to a ban on foreign holidays for French ministers. And easing the embargo, a loosening of US restrictions on Cuba divides expat opinion in Florida.
Can you imagine what 900 trillion cubic feet of gas looks like? Often 10,000 feet below the surface. Now try and imagine the technology needed to extract it. Then distributing that gas to a far-off and energy-hungry world. We believe in pushing technology to its limits. Now try and imagine a world without Qatar gas.
He's taken stolen goods and he's now dumping them onto the world without any sort of consideration for consequences.
From people making the news.
If the North will be saved a lot of trouble, I think it is important that they should come together.
To those it affects.
We do accept that there was very bad mistakes made in our banking area.
Behind the headlines.
Most South Koreans are not interested in reunification.
Is the inside story. At this time on Al Jazeera.
Hello again, this is the News Hour from Al Jazeera in Doha. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Our top stories this hour. Italian prosecutors are demanding that Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi go on trial immediately. The call follows allegations that he paid for sex with a 17-year-old Moroccan dancer and then used his political power to cover it up. Tension is running high between the US and Pakistan after an American shot and killed two armed men that he claimed were trying to rob him. Anti-US protests have been underway in Lahore since the incident happened nearly 2 weeks ago.